Well, Franklin, I'm glad that you have come on the program here to talk with me a little bit about this topic of racism. I think it's only fair, though, that you do that since I was just at your church and preached not long ago, which is one of the great experiences of my life, to preach to your black congregation. They certainly affirmed me, and they were right into it, and they sort of carried me along. They also said that I didn't have to preach just 10 minutes. They said I must have preached 25 minutes there, Franklin, and they were still with me.
Well, of course, that's one thing that I really feel that is a medium that will help all of us give some proper perspective and focus on the racism problem in our country and in our state and here in Toledo. And that's the medium of the gospel and the church. And our church is a predominantly black church. Even locally, we're a mixed congregation. And from our origins in 1886, our denomination was predominantly black, but mixed. And I think, as you've pointed out, and we've talked about in conversations in the past, that the gospel does help us to get a clear perspective on this problem and on some of the resolutions.
For sure. The gospel becomes the key for us. And I suppose that's the common element. I come in there as a preacher out of the Christian tradition, and there's sort of an immediate acceptance and a certain language that we all understand of Christ and Christ crucified and suffering Christ who calls us to grow and develop and so on. Well, Franklin, I want to talk about what I'm thinking of as sort of a new racism and how it applies to education. Both of us have ministered in the world of higher education at times, and I know that's my own frame of reference here. And I think one of the disturbing things when we talk about racism today is that black people are really attending college these days at a lower percentage rate than they were just a number of years ago. You know, we keep thinking we're going to make progress and do better, and education is one of the keys to all of this, and yet we have people coming in at a lower rate. One interesting thing I found that in 1987-88, there were only 4 black professors of PhDs in math that received their doctorates that year in the whole United States. You know, and we're trying to think how we're going to make progress and so on. And so I just throw that out as maybe a beginning point here to look at this racism question, and you see it at work surely in the world of education these days.
I think 2 things happened. One, with respect to black Americans, during the 60s, those who went on to higher education were very, very, very few, and almost an elitist group itself. And so the whole concept of a black person going to college was really something to strive for, so much so that it became seen not so much as a medium to bring about racial equality in our country, but almost a goal itself, you know. And for those of my generation, when we were ready to go to college in the middle 60s and late 60s, it was almost seemed as if you had to do it. You know, we were motivated, and of course through
part of your role.
Right.
Were your parents, Franklin, pushing that, or were you getting that from the culture as a whole?
I think the culture as a whole, in my particular instance, even more so than my parents wanted me to have a good job. In fact, when I graduated from high school, I was sort of prepped for a job with the Ohio Bell Telephone Company. At that time in '65, the president had just signed a mandatory affirmative action statement, and I became a active part of that. My parents wanted me really to get the job and forget about this education stuff, because you may not make it, and I wasn't an all-A student, even though it may be hard for you to believe. I wasn't an all-A student in high school, but education was seen almost as a goal. And of course,
were you
after
getting
we
that
achieved,
from teachers in high school then? If your parents,
no,
you were getting another message from your parents to get a job. Where was the message coming from?
It was coming from the things that were happening within the civil rights movement.
I see.
Now, my parents weren't, they did encourage me to get education and to go ahead, but to them, they saw the bottom line, work.
And probably a secure job, too.
Which was more important than taking a risk or taking a chance. Now,
so I would sort of interrupt you, because you had 2 points. The one was
that education was not seen as a medium, but as a goal. And
goal
we thought
in
that
itself.
utopia would open up once you had the education. The second point, though, is that racism still was very much alive in the employment market. And I don't want to get off into employment, but
right.
after you finish school, then what? Money just doesn't fall from the sky. And, of course, many black persons were not afforded employment opportunities. They still met racism. You mentioned that in the United States in '87 that only 4 persons graduated with PhDs in math.
4 black persons, yeah.
Being on the college campus, you're much aware of still the racial blocks and the classes that are victimized, the racial classes, and of course the other classes too, the female classes, the other minorities.
Yeah, that's a good point to make, isn't it? When you talk discrimination, there's a lot of types of discrimination that go on. Racism is one of those. I mean, we also have sexism as another type of discrimination.
I just found out this morning that those over 40 years old are a protective class, racism, and I didn't realize that being over 40 meant that non-identified with.
That's right. I think they got a name for that, ageism or something.
Yeah.
Well, Franklin,
but,
I want to
those
look
kind
at
of things knock the dream down and makes it seem like we're hopeless, and so we're not inspired. Young people aren't inspired to go on to higher education as we were earlier on.
In one way, that becomes sort of a foreign world, isn't it? Like if you think of black young men and women coming to the University of Toledo, I mean, they are clearly in a minority there, and there's a certain sense of isolation, and that we know that they meet certain racist attitudes. I mean, it's interesting that what we're finding these days among white students. There's sort of that part of that backlash. And I don't want to characterize this totally. I mean, a lot of our students, I think, that come to my church, and I believe that, they've overcome a lot of racist attitudes, and they've improved on this and made progress over a previous generation. I believe that. And I believe a lot of them are very much in tune with establishing racial justice and so on. But we still have a certain amount of racist attitudes. And what we find is that this kind of thing, well, the black people, the black students on our campus, they get preferential treatment. It was easier for them to get in. They let them in with lower test scores. Or they say things, how come we've got a black student union? We don't want a white student union, although I found one school that does have that. Temple University, by the way, has a white student union, and I think it's very racist-oriented. Well, maybe I shouldn't say that. It speaks a lot about they're opposed to affirmative action, put it that way. So we see some sense that, well, why should the black students have their own organization like this? And then they say that this affirmative action has given the black students an advantage, and maybe they've gotten grant money that the white students think should be coming their way. What I found in one article, Frank, was interesting. Somebody was talking about this as a new racism, in which each side, the white, just using this in terms of whites and blacks, because we also got Hispanics that we would have to put in here, right, and American Indians and Asiatics. So I guess we better circumscribe this. We're talking mostly white-black situation here. Well, they're saying that the whites kind of thing now is that we're victimized. These are the poor whites especially. We're victimized, and therefore we're not giving anymore. And this helps set up, I think, this atmosphere that we're seeing, which I think I'm calling this new racism on campus.
You're saying so many things that I want to respond
right. Well, jump
to,
in,
and
Franklin.
they're really.
I have a tendency to just go on, Franklin. But you
the very
jump
important
in.
facts that you're really and statements that you're really making. This idea of new racism, of course, to me I can't conceive it as being new. I think that we're more open and more willing, especially in this part of the country, the north part of the country, to talk about the subtle notions that and subtle biases that have been fed and nurtured through the years. But now we're beginning to talk more about them. If you remember back in 1980, with the famous Bacik case of admitting students to medical college, it was the same type of racism. When I came to campus at Ohio State, I was on the board of campus ministry there, and I brought that same perspective here to Toledo. There was what we call the revolving door policy. Blacks were allowed into college. Yes, they got in, but some of them weren't prepared. And, of course, the rigors of college life then allowed them to go right back out sometimes before 1 year was up. Well, white students see blacks coming into school, but they don't understand and aren't there to really feel the new pressure, the new unpreparedness. Most white students are prepared for college from day one. You know, their parents take out life insurance policies. They know they're going to college. There's no other way for them to think about living that excludes life in college. But for a lot of black students, it was a goal. They just wanted to get there. To get there itself was something to be patted on the back for. But once they were there, there wasn't a background, strong background in English or strong background in math. Reading comprehension, may have been low. And one of the things I think that we tried to address in our ministry was to, and along with the development of different college programs, was to help black students cope with areas of their academic life they weren't prepared for totally. Now that they're in college, it's sort of like a window dressing. They're there, but what do you do to keep them there?
Yeah, the retention programs are really crucial to avoid what you call the revolving door.
Right.
I was thinking, Franklin, a lot of white students simply would have no appreciation of what you're saying about the cultural problems, the societal difficulties, the pressures, and even feeling sort of isolated. I mean, if you're 10% of a campus, I mean, as a black student, I mean, that's evident to you. And you don't see a whole lot of black professors, do you?
No, you don't.
I mean, so you're in an alien environment in many ways. So, I mean, white students who have lived in the dominant society find it hard to appreciate this. I was reading about one white student who had to take some courses or did take them at a predominantly black school, and he ended up saying, well, now I have greater appreciation of what it means to be the outsider in a sense, in a setting. And without that kind of experience, I suppose it's very hard to know what the black students are going through and the pressures that they have. This would suggest, I guess, that a greater understanding is crucial to this business, isn't it, of overcoming a lot of the prejudices and racism that's involved.
It is. And a lot of that attention also needs to be addressed at the elementary and junior high and high school levels.
Yes.
47% of urban black teens, this was according to a 1981 report from the Education Committee of the United States, that 47% of black teens in 1981 were illiterate. And of course, we see classic examples all the time of pro basketball players who can't read, who don't know math. I remember growing up, of course I'm from Columbus, I bleed scarlet and gray. Even though I love the University of Toledo, I still bleed scarlet and gray. But one of the greatest fullbacks in Ohio State history, in fact he was second in the Heisman voting that year, Heisman Trophy voting that year, Bob Ferguson.
Yes.
By the time he finished 4 years at Ohio State University, he didn't have enough credits to be a sophomore. And things like that which go unaddressed at the college level. And the primary reason is because while he was in junior high and high school, all attention was given to his athletic abilities. And of course they get in college and ends up nothing.
Right. They really get exploited, don't they, is what happens. I mean,
in classical cases, yes, a lot of them do. And of course, that's not just black athletes, but that needs to be pointed out, that because blacks are on a college campus doesn't mean that they're really benefiting educationally. And of course, then the message that is sent back down to those who come after is, well, it didn't do them any good. I would be better off selling drugs or doing crime or
trying to get that solid job right away after high school. Frankly,
or go to the Army.
Thinking of another option. The thinking about this attitude question again, I notice a lot of the articles I read suggest that the problem from the white student side is largely indifference. In other words, they don't seem to be a lot of them, this blatantly racist, like they want to fight against black people or something, but they're indifferent. I mean, well, they got their chance. What do they want? Let's just ignore it and it'll go away. I'm not responsible for this situation. I didn't cause it. I mean, why are you bugging me about it? And then the other sense is then that if this indifference leads, if there is a racial incident on campus, which we have periodically, that then the people who perpetrate it, the people who are aggressively racist, feel like they're supported
Yeah.
by the majority, because the majority doesn't say anything. They don't say, hey, this is bad. They just slough it off and go about their business. And then these few racists think, yeah, all these other people are behind me. I think so that indifference has great ramifications, like the notion of Edmund Burke that all that you need for the triumph of evil is for the good people to do nothing. And I think that that's what we often have happening here.
And I think that's a whole area, an arena that we who try to address this racism problem really need to give some more sensitive thought to. That there are persons, black and white, who really don't even understand the nature of racism, institutional racism. And as you said, that if I'm not made aware of what it means to be a racist, I don't know.
Right.
There are a lot of good people in many churches. As you know, Sunday morning is still, 11 o'clock Sunday morning is still the most racist hour in the
Sad to
week,
say,
in our country. You know, we go off to our own individual black and white churches, and it's sad. And yet those people who are sitting in churches, I think, are well-meaning, the majority, good-intentioned persons, but because of a lack of coming together, of sitting down. You're familiar with the story that Jesus told, or was told about Jesus. There was a blind man waiting on the side for Jesus to pass by. And as Jesus came by, he cried out, "Oh, thou son of David, help me." And Jesus went to him. He said, "What do you want me to do?" And he said, "I need you to touch my eyes so I can see. Heal me." And Jesus got down and got some clay and spit on it, some dirt, and made clay, put it on his eyes, wiped it off, and asked the man, "Well, what do you see?" He said, "Well, I see men, but I see them as trees."
Yes.
That wasn't good enough. And the story, concludes that Jesus touched his eyes again so that he could be made perfectly whole. And I think what often we get is not being touched completely like
to
Christ.
be able to see.
We see people as trees, inanimate objects.
Right.
And until Christ can really touch us and we allow him to
really see people as people.
Right.
Frankly, I love that that use of that gospel story. I think it's an excellent one, and I think it brings us back here to a Christian perspective on all of this. I mean, we can't just let this racism go. I mean, from the viewpoint of Jesus, racism is a sin. From a Christian viewpoint, has to say this is wrong. Institutional racism is a social sin, and personal prejudice is a sinful attitude. That has to be said loud and clear. But I think what I liked about what you said is that we believe that Jesus can come and cure us of that he can heal us. And a whole lot of it is to shape our attitudes, to open our eyes to the problem, I guess the phrase we use these days is to raise our consciousness about the problem, and so that we get to know each other better and can come to appreciate each other's cultures and styles and background, and then out of that we form a more unified whole.
Right.
So Jesus is our touchstone here, isn't he? I mean, he suggests the attitude, the perspective, the worldview that we need to have if we're going to come closer together.
I think so. When I talk about racism or the climate of racism, I've come to try to look at it and from three different perspectives. First of all, what's the general mood? How do people really feel? Whether there's factual stuff going on or not, how do you feel? And not just one person, but the group of people who are there. How do they feel about being where they're at, about doing what they're doing? How does it feel to be in a math class and never see any math professors? Or to see math instructors who've been on the tenure track for 10 and 15 years and still have not been granted full professorships. What's the mood of the people? And then secondly, what are the facts? What can you document that really is a racist fact going on? But then finally, I try to look at what effective things are being done to address the issue. And for us from the Christian church, then I believe we do have to use Christ both as a guide and a medium to perceive what's going on, to feel what's going on, as a medium to get to know persons from different cultures, from the different races.
Yes. I like your threefold distinction there, sort of catching the climate and the mood, and then and then eventually moving to this action.
Yeah.
I mean, what are we going to do
Right.
about this after we've looked at the facts and so on? The facts are not good in terms of education and black people in the United States. I mean,
That's true.
we have not made a lot of progress despite our efforts. So and Christ tells us we better do something about it, help people to see. Now, what is it that we're going to do? Well, I mean, one of the things is that it's going to help us if we can create a climate of the importance of education, right? But you've pointed out one of the difficulties of that is young black people are saying, well, why should I? Because I won't be able to get a job. So we begin to see it's terribly interrelated, isn't it?
It is.
In other words, we got a large social problem here that we're going to have to address. I mean, if I just look at the university, we'd say, well, what we would like to do is to get more black professors on campus. That would help. Very often they have found that black studies programs help. That we've had them going for a couple of decades now, and in many places they've really gained great acceptance in the curriculum, and they've helped people in terms of multicultural education. That's something we talk a lot about at the university these days. Let's have multicultural education. Let's help each other understand our backgrounds, our traditions, the mores and ethos that shaped us as we grew up so that we can appreciate each other. So all of that seems to be part of it here at the university level. Now, I mean, I'm sure we're going to do all kind of other things, too, along the way to make this work better. I know as soon as I'd say that, the professors at the university would say, hey, we try to get black professors, but it's very difficult to do. And so the problems are no doubt very difficult.
Yeah, but then you can raise your own, train your own. I benefited again while I was at Ohio State and doing undergrad work in social science, and part of my my major was history. And I had a counselor in the history department who just really, for some reason, took to me and kept saying to me, you would make a fine addition to our department. And he kept saying that. Well, I think what he was doing, he was a white counselor, and what he was doing was saying to me, we want you, you know, feel a part of being in this department. Think about it. And it was grooming me, actually. You know, had I wanted to pursue that field, there would have been some doors open for me. Now, I think colleges can raise their own. If you can't find somebody, then create a person, because there are plenty of black persons with skill, with capabilities, with desire, with aspiration. But let me suggest something else if I can.
Yes.
I'm concerned about the role, the perceived role of the church in all of this. And I really feel that more and more society as a whole is beginning to push the church more to the background. You know, we have professors in education, so let's use them to develop programs. And granted, I think that we should do that, but I also think that we can be creative. What about some multi-Christian fellowships centered around educational activities? You know, what about some multi-Christian fellowships centered around educational seminars, speakers on education? What about the church, on-campus church, off-campus church, you know, joining hands to take some leadership? Churches from the white community, you know, what would be wrong with churches from Maumee coming in to the urban city of Toledo and joining hands with some churches and really doing some things together jointly to upgrade the awareness of both white children and black children regarding receiving an education, receiving it together, understanding where we're both coming from. Now, we do some things ecumenically, you know, as adults.
I see what you're saying, yeah. A lot of it would seem to me, on this education track that we're dealing with here, would be creating a climate where minorities in the United States would feel as though this is sort of the thing to do, to get back as part of what you were talking about that you got at some time along the line that says, no, this is what you should be striving for. I mean, you know, if you got capabilities and so on, you should maximize those. And this is open to you, and we'll try to do something about it. We encourage you. I mean, just a simple thing. I remember that we had a black young man delivering papers at my house. And I remember each time I would see him, I'd always say he was a big young man and I guess a good athlete from what I heard. And and I was saying, well, are you studying?
Yeah.
Are you
Yeah.
doing your studies?
Yeah.
Education's important. You're going to be a good athlete, but education's really crucial in all this. And I mean, I was just trying to say an encouraging word to him along. I mean, it's almost like what you were saying that the white counselor did for you. I mean, it's like you got to plant the seed.
Right.
You got to tell them. I think the University of Toledo does something good in this, in inviting the youngsters to campus sometimes, so
Exactly.
that it's not a foreign territory to them.
Right.
So they say, boy, I could live here. I could function here.
I think Dr. Cooks and her staff and volunteers and staff who work with her at the university do a great job in following through with some of those types of things. And that notion itself was a survival of the black community in our country. I've been nurtured greatly, I think, throughout my whole life, but it's not a unique experience. When I would come home from school, people would stop you on the street. Persons who knew my great-grandfather, who died before I was born, and they said, "Oh, you Bob Foy's great-grandson. You gonna mount to something. You gonna be somebody."
Yeah.
And those types of
Gives you
things.
encouragement.
It
Yeah.
does.
That's really helpful. Well, Franklin, we're talking here about racism and something I was calling the new racism. Maybe we have to get clarification of that. But in education, there's a lot of subtle things that are going on that are troublesome. There's a new kind of racism that says, well, the blacks have had their chance, affirmative action, and we're against it, and we've got indifference on the part of a lot of white students, and we've got to change a lot of that. A lot of attitudes have to be changed, and as you well pointed out, Jesus Christ is our center for that. Christ calls it, he helped the blind man to see, didn't he? And that, I guess he's helping all of us to see the problem, and then, as you said, to do something constructive about it.